Hello, everyone. So today we have a very special guest. You can have a look, Mr. Samir Arora from Helios Capital. To just give his background. Before that, I will just start about us. PMS World as a platform over last 2 years has evolved as a knowledge platform for investing in PMS and AI products. Over last 2 years, we have hosted more than 100 fund managers and have done many knowledgeable talks regarding COVID-19 to Wealth 20, Invest Sense series, Alpha Mevin series, and in that regards, we have discussed each and every aspect of investing into equity portfolios in terms of various styles, in terms of various risks, in terms of various aspects that one needs to check. So, we are a new age wealth management firm in that regards. Before, I give a quick background about Samir, though all of us know he doesn't know about it, we do not need any introduction. This particular chapter that we are going to cover is about sharing the learnings of a veteran manager, money manager, who has been into these markets for more than 3 decades. So, Samir brings with him a very high standards of investing execution. Starting with his qualification, he did his engineering from IIT Delhi, and then he went to IIM Calcutta, and then he has done his post graduation from the Wharton School. Post that, he brings with him more than 3 decades of experience. So that is exactly what I'm trying to quote here, that as one of the core aspects of analyzing and understanding who is going to be a money manager, Mr. Samir Arora brings a lot of credentials to his experience. And in that regards, particularly, we are not going to discuss any product here, but we're going to discuss whatever Samir has learned from markets over the last 3 decades. Over to you, Samir.
Okay, in the meantime, I can start by saying thank you very much as this presentation gets loaded. And basically, you overdid my experience bit. It's a little less than 30 years. I'm old, but every year that I can save is also valuable. So actually, I have more like 28 and a half, 29 years of experience, which is pretty good. And I seem to have India's longest track record as a public markets manager. And so let me share some of that as it says 1 minute to load. In the meantime, maybe you can talk more about your.
Yeah. So I was, going to say that, we already have, past 10 minutes, but we have enough time. As you can say, as we were discussing, we can continue for even 2 hours, but we keep it for, 1 hour.
It's there now.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. These are all new things we are learning every day. But so basically, I will talk today about the philosophy and about what we have learned over the years, because everything that we see in the markets, it doesn't seem to be like that in reality in terms of what people say and what people do. And let me give you some views on that. But my biggest problem with fund management industry is that people believe that they have found a formula. They feel that they have some magic formula on the basis of which this market works. And what we've seen over the years, and I'll show you, is that there's no real formula. The formula can be that you will be disciplined and that you'll not overpay and that you'll buy quality, which is obvious, those kind of formulas. But beyond that, it is still everybody's guess whether this kind of thing works or that kind of research works, whether top down is better or bottom up is better. There is no real answer. Because if there had been an answer, everybody would move towards it. And this is what I say about this thing. But let me start. So the thing is that there are always 2 views in our market. There is no one view. And if your mind is not open enough or you are not reading enough, you will, let's say, for example, read this book or think about this book, the little book of value investing, and you'll be convinced at the end of it that value investing is the place to be. And then the same little book series will have a book which says a proven market beating formula for growth investing. It's the same publishers, the same size of the book, the same format of the book. And then, of course, we've all heard about Benjamin Graham and how he's Warren Buffett's guru, and Warren Buffett learned value investing from him. And so you will read this book and think that value investing is the place to be. And then the same book and the same name will be used in saying Benjamin Graham and the Power of Growth Stocks. My point always has been that there are fund managers in the world who manage global money. They manage money in 80 countries, 40 countries, or 10 countries. There are even bigger fund managers who may manage in the same fund equities and commodities and equities and gold and equities and bitcoins. And we, because we are sitting in India, have to choose every day whether we like quality stocks, we only invest in mid-cap stocks, we only invest in cyclical stocks. Why are we so dumb that we in one market have to become so narrow that this is the only thing we do, whereas similar people to us, similar background, similar intelligence can go around the world and say we invest in 40 countries and 30 commodities and stuff like that. So I've always felt that there is no real need in a single market to become even more narrow, as if that is some gold formula that somebody has found. But let me continue. So then you'll find this book talking about how crowds are mad and how you should be independent and how should you take your own decisions. And this book is very famous on extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds. But you can also read this book, which I have read, which is on the wisdom of crowds. And actually India's world's second biggest company, or third biggest these days, Google, has basically been created on the theory of the wisdom of crowds. So what I say is listen to everyone, believe no one, because there is no real answer. And what you see in our markets is not what you get. The old software thing was WYSIWYG, which is what you see on the screen is what you get, or what you see is what you get. Here it is, what you see is not what you get. And I will give you some examples. Now, this, unfortunately, the way this slide normally worked as I had planned it was that the title comes first and then the body comes as my counter. But unfortunately, this format of this is it all comes together, which takes away some of my making a point. But here people, the first thing that everybody says and does is that we buy stocks where we have high conviction. And the reality is that that is totally wrong. What you do with conviction is to not do things. So for example, Warren Buffett would say, I don't buy tech, let us say. Ignore Apple for a minute. He says, I don't buy tech. And actually, that is his highest conviction. His highest conviction is not Coca-Cola. His highest conviction is tech, in which he says, I will not invest. Why? Because he chose to stop it at that point. He didn't pursue it further. He didn't say, I'll go and meet 100 companies in tech, or I will ask my friend Bill Gates, or I will read their reports. He says, tech is not for me. If you are dating a girl and with a view to marry her, if you meet her for the first time, and you're highly convinced that she's not for you, the story ends. But actually, if you think that one day you will marry her, you go through hundreds of other things of saying, now I want to talk to her a second time, or I want to meet her parents, because you are not convinced. So conviction is higher in paths that we don't follow. And we in investing have to incorporate that into our thinking. For example, somebody may say that I have a 50-point checklist after which I buy my stocks. And nobody has ever asked them except me that what happens when you have checked 48 items? Are you not convinced? Nobody has asked Warren Buffett that if he said that he read IBM annual reports for 50 years before he bought IBM, which turned out to be a wrong decision, separate matter. But nobody asked him that when you had read it for 48 years, what had happened? You were not convinced. So the point is, you don't buy stocks where you have high conviction. You don't buy stocks where you have high conviction, and you buy stocks where you have low conviction, and you keep trying and trying and trying to reach a point at which you say, now I have done my 50-point checklist, so I'll buy it. And this is not an academic point. I'll show you how it should be incorporated in an investment process. Sorry, press the wrong thing. Then again, this whole thing is there that we should own stocks for the long term. Actually, it is illogical. Even we have many stocks that we own for the long term, but it is actually illogical to own stocks for the long term. Here, I'm only questioning. I'm not saying what I do. So let's look at it. If there are 20 stocks in your portfolio, and Warren Buffett, of course, already said it in 1965. If you own 20 stocks, and out of, say, 100 stocks, 200 stocks are in this, he's saying 3,000 stocks, and next year, the prices of these 3,000 stocks have gone up and down. The fundamentals of these stocks have gone up and down, and sometimes significantly up and down. How is it possible that the same 20 stocks which you chose last year as the best stocks out of that universe, what a coincidence that the same 20 are the best stocks for this year. How does it work in a fund management industry or in a PMS industry, where today we start a PMS and we find the 20 best stocks for today's audience and say buy them and hold them forever, and next year a new investor comes in, and instead of saying to him that based on today's prices and today's fundamental, these are the 20 stocks, we say, no, sorry. Last year, when we started the PMS, we had said we buy for the long term. And therefore, those 20 stocks have been running from that time. You just go and buy them. So the reality is very different if you think deeply. What you do may be a more practical matter, but I'm just saying that to literally take these things and run with them like many people do is completely wrong. Again, we are talking about Warren Buffett, not because we think that Warren Buffett doesn't know anything, but because Warren Buffett is the only guy who wrote for so many years. His annual reports are out. His data is there. If we had similar data for George Soros, maybe we would have analyzed him. But Warren Buffett is famous for saying that you should have only 20 punches in an investment decision, lifetime, in the sense what he means to explain is that think of stocks before you, think carefully before you buy, as if you have only 20 chances to buy stocks. Don't every day come and buy a new stock or sell a new stock, but let us see out of interest in this business, that what did he do himself. So this is an academic report, academic paper called Overconfidence, Underreaction, and Warren Buffett's Investment. So they have analyzed for 26 years, which were his prime years from 1980 to 2006, as to what his own, because he has to disclose every quarter, that what did he do with the stocks, which ones did he buy, what did he sell. And it appears that, his median holding period is only 1 year, that approximately 20% of stocks only are held for more than 2 years, and 30% of them are sold within 6 months. This is Warren Buffett himself. He did not have any assistant portfolio managers at that time, and this is not a short period. This is the big prime period of his life. If you look at Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, he has made his money out of maybe 5-7 stocks. Big money out of 5-7 stocks, whether it's Titan or Lupin or Crisil or maybe Tata Motor these days or whatever. But you don't associate him with 4 stocks. He would have bought 50, 80, 100, 200 stocks in his life, of which 5 worked really well. Some may have worked a little less well, and some may have caused him losses. So in the end, they may have all broken even. But you never started by saying, I have 20 chances in life, because it is just made as a way to explain, but not to follow. Another favorite of mine is that people say we will buy companies with good management. So what does it even mean to say that a company has good management? If a multinational company is listed in India, what is good management? Is it the parents that is good management? Is it the local company that is good management? Is it that individual who's the new CEO is the good management? In a Tata group, if TCS has good management because it has good corporate governance or capital allocation, do we say that Tata Motor also has because it's part of the same group? And when will you know that a company has good management? If HDFC Bank lists in 1995, how many years are you required to analyze it? How many years are you supposed to see to say that this guy knows capital allocation, that this guy is good in corporate governance, that when a crisis comes, he does not cheat you? So are you supposed to wait for a crisis to test a company? All these things are important, except to just say buy companies with good management. Again, I am not doing it as an academic exercise. We will tell you how we deal with this. And the second is, how will you separate the halo effect? Halo effect basically means that if a company's stock price is going up, everybody believes it has good management. And if a company's stock price is down, everybody believes it is bad management. Let me explain. Sorry, this way. Okay. So in 2000, all these things come together. In another form, it would have come one by one. So in May 2000, Cisco was rated as Fortune magazine's most admired company and all that they do every year. And this is what the magazine wrote about the company in May 2000, when the price was $80. Cisco must be considered one of America's truly outstanding companies. John Chambers is the most customer focused human being, etc. And then 1 year later, the price of the stock fell to $15. And the same magazine, maybe the author was different, but who cares, says Cisco has exhibited a cavalier attitude towards potential customers. Cisco sales techniques have been irksome and have alienated customers. And at the top it said, John Chambers is the most customer focused human being you'll ever find. Look at more examples of halo effect. So in the 1980s, actually, I read this book when I was at IIM. There was a book called In Search of Excellence, written by two guys who were McKinsey partners. And you can broadly believe that they spent maybe 2 years, 3 years, whatever number of years they took to identify good managements. Unlike you and me and fund managers and retail investors who will be doing a job in the day and then expected to find good management, as we call it, these guys would have spent 2-3 years over it, let's say, to write a book. And when the book came out, the study was done that for the next 10 years, what happened to those 31 companies, and 13 of them underperformed the S&P and 18 the other way around, 13 outperformed and 18 underperformed. Then another famous book, which is more recent, I think maybe in the 90s, called Built to Last. From the very name of the book, you can see that it was to find managements or companies that have been built to last. This is a study where people who are as qualified as our fund managers and more qualified than the average guys, because these are all professors and PhDs, and who are spending 2-3 years each of their life in just finding companies that are built to last. And what are the companies they found? Citibank, more or less destroyed in 2008. Ford, gone. GE, gone. HP, gone. IBM, gone, sort of, as far as we are concerned. Motorola, really gone. Nordstrom, gone. These are people who spent 3-4 years to find good managements or good companies. Then the same guy, Jim Collins, he wrote another book. This book is an actual super bestseller if you search on the net, called Good to Great. And let's see, first of all, he didn't have a single company which was in the previous study which said built to last. But let's look at the companies that went from good to great. Circuit City, Fannie Mae is bankrupt and gone. Kimberly Clark, more or less gone. Kroger, gone. Pitney Bowes, I don't know where it is, but mostly gone. Walgreens, nothing much. And Wells Fargo doing very badly for the last 10-15 years. All these companies at that time were doing very, very, very well. There is no way that you found some out of the way stock down 70% saying this is a company built to last. Nobody's ever done that, and nobody ever does that even now. There is no company, I ask all these analysts, where the stock is down 65% and you say it has excellent management. There is no such concept in our system. Then the other normal thing which is used, and then we'll come to how we deal with this, is if you're sure of growth, price of stock will take care of itself. Now, this actually at a big picture is also a ridiculous thing for anybody to say, because at some point we are buying earnings, or we are buying dividends, or we are buying cash per stock. Whatever you're buying one of these 3-4 things. If you're super smart, you'll say, oh, I don't buy earnings, I buy cash flow and all that. But these are all refinements of the same concept. But how can it be that when you're buying something like this, the price that you pay for it doesn't matter? So this actually, again, should have come into separate. This is from this book, Future for Investors, which is a great book written by Jeremy Siegel, a professor from Wharton School. So he's given example of IBM and Standard Oil. For 53 years, IBM had much better growth than Standard Oil. So this is not a 2-year that the numbers were better, or 4 years, but for 53 years, while IBM was growing its earnings per share at 10.9% per year, for 53 years, Standard Oil was growing that at 7.47% per year. But over that 53-year period, Standard Oil outperformed IBM because starting price matters. Let's look at it in an Indian sense. So this is an example of Infosys, which for 5 years, from 2000 to 2005, had its earnings growth of 44.5% per annum for 5 years. And the stock did not go up 1%. It went from 139 to 141 and maybe paid some dividends along the way, which may, you can say, 1 or 2%. So it went up 2% per annum, while its earnings grew 45% per annum. And then the same Infosys in another phase, its earnings grew only 10% per annum. But because its starting numbers were in valuations were much lower, it was only a 15 PE company. The price was like more than doubled in that period. I'm only right now giving what we, as I was saying, is that what people say in our business and what is the reality, and then we'll come to how anybody else can deal with it. Another very commonly used thing is, and this, actually Warren Buffett has been most unfair to the world, because I think this is also one of his lines: diversification is a protection against ignorance. It makes very little sense for those who know what they are doing. Now, by saying that, he makes it nearly impossible for fund managers to say that they are diversified, whatever be the definition of diversified, because then you will turn around and say, but aha, Warren Buffett says that you are ignorant, because it is only for ignorant people that you should have diversification. But the reality is that we don't know we are ignorant till something unexpected happens. So, and let's look at it in some other thought experiment. Let us say there are only 100 investors in the world who are concentrated. So they are, let us assume, obviously not ignorant, because for them it did not make sense to be diversified. Now, unless you say that all of them landed up buying Bajaj Finance and HDFC Bank and Kotak Bank, mostly you will have to assume that they will buy slightly different stocks. Somebody will buy this, somebody will buy that, and some will be common. So these 100 guys who are very smart, very intelligent, very clued in, and completely unlike people like us or others who believe in a little bit of diversification, know exactly what they are doing. So they buy collectively maybe 200-300 stocks. If not, theoretically, they should have bought, let's say, 1,000 stocks, because each guy is buying 10 stocks. And so totally there would have been 1,000 stocks owned by these 100 investors, but many of them were common, between 2, maybe more. So let's say together they had only 1.5 independent stock and the rest were all common. So in the end, you had 150 stocks in which people were concentrated. Now, if I land up randomly from Mars and buy from that 35 companies, how have I done something wrong? Because each of these companies, somebody who has bought things that he knows about it. So the reality is, any stock you buy, somebody is going to be concentrated in it, more or less. Whether you are concentrated or not doesn't matter. He is concentrated in it, so he believes in it. Because he is concentrated, he's an intelligent guy, he's a smart guy. So therefore, if we buy the same stock, it should not make any difference. The reality is that if there are 100 concentrated guys, almost by definition, some will do well and some will do badly. And that is actually what life is. It has nothing to do with concentration. It is to do with that somebody will be right and somebody will be significantly wrong. And so your trade-off is whether you want to take those extreme bets or slightly controlled bets. It has nothing to do with the strategy being right or wrong. And another thing is, which I ask many of these institutional guys from the US, and they get very upset. And now I can even make the Indian public upset by asking them the same question. That if you really think that concentrated strategy is better, you don't have the guts to buy one fund. If you buy 3 such concentrated funds and therefore end up having 35 stocks, are you concentrated or diversified? How does it matter that each of these different funds was concentrated? You are not concentrated, so how does it matter to you? Let them be. So the point is even by any logic, concentration is not practical and it makes no sense. But of course, you can define what you mean by concentration and diversification. But this again is Warren Buffett's line that diversification may preserve wealth, but concentration builds wealth. I have been, depends on what we call concentrated. I have been always a mutual fund manager and then a hedge fund manager, whatever. But broadly, we've always owned 30 to 40 stocks. And over my life, I can't tell you my returns here, although I've said it in many presentations and you can take it. It is a bit mind-blowing and it is not related to concentration or diversification. But let's look at Mr. Buffett himself. So Mr. Buffett says that diversification is for protecting wealth. But whatever he may say, his own concentrated holdings have hurt him. Initially in his life, he had 3 or 4 or 5 good concentrated bets that worked. But the whole problem with this business is that, let us say it was flipped around. That means suppose your first 3-4 concentrated bets work, and therefore your 1 has become 10. You are already a superstar, and then you can have 3 flops and it will not matter. But for somebody else, if they had the same mix of good and bad stocks, but the bad stocks came first, your history. So that is more a lottery. But let's look here. So Coca-Cola, he bought in 1988 sometime. We don't know when, but it came in his accounts and he reported it at the end of 88. So I have taken the performance from the end of 88 to 31st December 2020. During this period, the stock is up 12.2%, but Berkshire stock itself is up 14.4%, which means Coca-Cola has hurt Berkshire because Coca-Cola stock has done less well than the Berkshire's own stock has done. Similarly for Wells Fargo, he bought it in 1990. So we've taken it from the 1990 December period. So from at least from December, and maybe in the first 6 months it did money for him, who knows. So it's gone up 11.6%, but his own stock has gone up 14%. So Wells Fargo has hurt him. American Express, same thing. But of course, there'll be some intelligent guy sitting here who will say, but he has bought Apple and made $70 billion, and now that has been conveniently ignored. So let's look at Apple. So this is his portfolio, which he reported as the top holdings in December 2019. Now we know that many of these stocks, not Apple, but many of these stocks he sold during the year, but we don't know exactly what, which date, whatever. So we are just assuming that he held them for the full year. In reality, he sold some of these at much worse prices than what the prices were in December, because the market kept going up after he had sold. But let's look at just this to see how concentration does not work. So for him, Apple has worked, and he made 82% in Apple. And he made something like, you can see here, $60 billion in Apple. But look at his number 2 stock, number 3 stock, number 4 stock, number 5 stock, number 6 stock, number 7 stock. All of them massively underperformed the index. If you want to play a lottery where one of the thing was Apple and you get Apple right, sure. But you see, even for the best of guys, a concentrated portfolio does not show that he knows anything about it. If you see here, other than Moody's, if you can see the numbers, every other than Apple and Moody's, every other stock that he had underperformed the S&P last year. And this is assuming that he held it for the whole year. We already know he didn't. Some he sold in March, April, May. So he sold, forget about the selling part, but every one of them underperformed. So this idea that because I am concentrated, I know what I am doing is absolutely thrown out of the water by this thing. No theory of mine, actual data. Now look at our story. I mean, not our story, but India's story. So, in the last 25 years, Nestle is up 131 times, but Colgate is up 23 times only. And Lever is up 59 times. Now, please somebody should tell after this, how in 1990, whatever, 6 or whenever, March 31, 1996, how would you have thought that you should buy Nestle? You could have easily bought Colgate. You could have got Levers and concentrated on it. Why would you have only bought Reliance? Why wouldn't you have bought Grasim or ACC or Ambuja? But if you bought Reliance, you're a hero. And if you bought ACC, you are a zero. And God forbid, if you had bought Tata Motors, then what would you be doing? So this idea that I will concentrate and I will make money is, you're saying I'm taking part in a lottery and we'll see how it goes, which we don't like. So our theory is that nobody knows anything about anything beyond a point. So what have we learned? So first thing is, you have to be the casino and not the gambler. What does that mean? So when we go to a casino, the casino has only a slight statistical advantage over the gambler. So for example, if some of you may know, what is the advantage that a casino has in a roulette game? The game where you have 36 numbers, and if you put money on any one of them, if you put it on a number and not on the color, you will get 36 times your money. Now there are 36, 1 to 36. So what is the advantage a casino has? That actually there are 38 numbers there. There is a 0 and a double 0. So which means there are 38 numbers on the roulette, but you will get only 36 times the money. That means if you put 111 on all the 38, you will give them 38, but you'll get back only 36. And so that is the small statistical advantage that the casino has. But you can go and play it once and bet on number 8, and number 8 comes and you walk away with 36 instead of 1. So you can win once in a while. But if you play if you play continuously, you will lose. And if you play continuously, the casino will win. Now look at blackjack. So in blackjack, what happens, if you know the game, is that who crosses 21 is out. So you are being given a card and the dealer has a card. But your cards are seen first. That means if you cross 21, you are out. And then there's no rule that now we will see what the casino's cards were or the dealer's cards were in case they also cross 21. No, your cards have been seen, you are out. That is the only advantage the casino has, that they don't have to say, okay, now maybe I also had cards which would have crossed 21, so both of us would have been out, which means you would not have lost. It would be like a draw. But you can go and win. But the lesson is you have to be a casino, because in this game, we only have a small advantage over the market. The advantage over the market is that the market is whatever the market is, and we can choose from that market and say, but this one is little better, this one has little better quality, but you can't bet everything on it. It's a small statistical advantage, and it will only work if you play the game more than once. If you make it a habit, if you make it that I will put 35 bets on the table, and my bet is that some of them, because I have this advantage, will suddenly pay me much more and I will win. It cannot be that I will bet one stock or two stocks or three stocks with this knowledge, because with three stocks, it's lottery. Just like when you go to a casino and win, effectively you won a lottery with little better odds than maybe 1 in 100 odds, but it's still a lottery. So the thing is, you have to play the game repeatedly. And to play the game repeatedly, you can't say, I will buy one stock because I like it, because nobody knows what will happen to any one stock. This is a more formal thing of this lesson, which I only saw last year. If you see, this study has come out in April 2020. But basically saying that funds which do well, these funds all did well, supposedly they beat the market by whatever 2.5% per annum, but their number one holding did not do better than their fund, which means they could identify 10, 15 stocks or 20 stocks that were good, but they could not say which of them within those 20 was the best and which one should have been rated 1. Nobody knows that. Or if they sometimes get it right, it is more a matter of luck, because this itself shows that there is no substantial evidence that the best ideas of the fund outperform the rest of their own portfolio. So the portfolio as a whole did well. But within that, between the things that were good, who knew? So we say quickly that there are 4 things which you need to build a portfolio, which is which stocks to buy, what is the time horizon, how many stocks to own at a time, and when to sell. This is it. But each of them has to have some bit of thought. And now time is running. How many minutes do I have? Otherwise, I'll do it faster.
No, your presentation is very interesting. You have as much time as you can take.
No.
Otherwise, absolutely.
Okay, no.
Yeah.
No problem. Yeah. Okay. So which stocks to buy broadly, that we say that we start with what not to buy. The reason being that you may say that I like good management, as I was saying, or we like good history, or we like good corporate governance, or we like clean accounting, or we like some triggers, or we like reasonable valuations. But there is no answer to saying what is good. We don't know what is good management. What is good employee? Nobody knows. We know what is a bad employee. A bad employee is one, let's say, who does not do his work. But if the guy does his work, is he a good employee? We don't know. Maybe he harasses women in the evening. Maybe he steals money in the morning. There is no definition of good. The definitions are all only of bad. So we don't know what is good management. As long as it is not bad management, 90% of the job is done. And that is easier to analyze. But to say, I know that this company does this and nobody knows. All we are trying to do is don't buy the bad as far as possible. And then again, because I thought of these things long time ago, but books I've been reading since then, I discover, this guy is saying what I've been saying. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb in Skin in the Game said, via negativa. Whenever I type it, PowerPoint tries to make it via negative, but they say via negativa. Acting by removing is more powerful and less error prone than via positiva. Acting by addition. I used to only say that it is easier to know what is bad than to know what is good, because there is no definition of good. The definitions are all of bad. If a company does not steal money, so you're not supposed to steal money. How does that make you good? But if you stole money, you are bad. That is an easier one to look at. So what we say is, forget about this. This is for our fun thing. That basically you take points and then you reject on them. You try and reject as many as you can on different factors, because if you see all the scam companies, is there any company that turned out to be a surprise scam? Not really. Even Satyam, because he was shot on the day Raju wrote that letter. 2 weeks ago, because we were not short 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, Satyam had tried to merge with Matas. And it was very obvious at that time that there is either problem with Matas or a problem with Satyam, because they were at that, in 2008, trying to merge a real estate company or a construction stroke real estate company with a tech company. So maybe before that, we also didn't think it's a scam or some fraud is there. Point is, everything is known. If you just were to not buy the bad things, 30-50% of the job is done. And we have these various factors which we have made on points where we are trying to reject. Now, the problem is, it looks very easy to present to you and say, I will not buy some divan housing because it had a fraud. But most of the other cases, what happens is that nothing is black and white. Let us say he does capitalize some of its earnings, but its valuation is very cheap. He's good management, but on a bad day, he issued options to himself. So there will be this only 5 examples in life which will be blatantly good and blatantly bad. Rest of the life is gray. So that is where the research is required to say whether you should reject it or say let it be part of life. Let it be that he has this one problem because his brother is on the board, because doesn't matter, because world can handle it for some other reason, that he's in a good industry, good whatever, some story. But still you have to balance and still reject.